Chapter 38 Pyre. Constant, pitiless, ever increasing, the stench assaulted us as we made our reluctant way to the battlefield to deal with our dead. I pressed my lips tightly together to keep from vomiting. Where earlier soldiers had built their cook fires, now funeral pyres were being lighted. So many that the vista in front of us was covered in a haze of smoke. I blinked my stinking eyes. The Chandals, whose job it was to burn bodies, rushed from fire to fire, shaking their cudgels and yelling at the mourners to keep their distance. Dressed only in loincloths, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, they looked like the guards of hell. But when I glanced past them, a strange sight met my eyes. The battlefield was filled with white shapes. In my confused numbness that looked like snowbirds, the large, wingless ones poets sometimes sing of, that live at the far northern edge of the world, where neither herb nor grain grows. They moved uncertainly, like creatures that have lost their way in a storm and emerge from it to find themselves in a strange, frightening terrain. From time to time they emitted sharp, wordless cries. It took me a moment to recognize what I was looking at. Not birds, but widows who had travelled from Hastinapur and Indraprastha, and who knew how many other cities of Bharat, who had congregated here to do what nature never required of bird or beast. For it is only we humans that create such tragic duties for ourselves, to identify their dead and perform their final rites. It was soon clear that they would find the first of the tasks impossible. The kings and commanders who had died in duels, though mangled, were recognizable. But the sons and husbands of these women, the common soldiers who are the first casualty of every war, had been annihilated by astras or crushed to pulp beneath chariots and stampeding beasts. There was nothing left of them but heaps of rotting flesh. When the women realized that they would not be able to view the bodies of their loved ones, they grew frenzied with despair. Some called down curses so vituperative on my husband's heads that I shuddered. Strangely, they didn't curse Duryodhan. Perhaps his death had absolved him in their minds. Or perhaps there's no satisfaction in cursing someone who can't hear you. Others tried to kill themselves with the weapons that were strewn about the field. Still others threw themselves onto the pyres stacked with bodies. Their tormented cries as their white garments charred to black were more unbearable than all the death's screams I'd heard in battle. My own despair receded as I watched their agony. A horrified Yudhister ordered the guards to stop the women from harming themselves, to bring them to him. It wasn't easy. Crazed with fear and grief, the women fought the guards with whatever strength they had left. Some threw themselves down into the bloody mire and refused to move. Some tried to run away. Some called on their dead husbands' spirits to save them. They didn't trust Yudhishthir. They didn't want to come anywhere near him. Wasn't he the one who caused their husbands' deaths? Wasn't he the one who made them widows? Who knew what he'd do to them now? At first, the guards were taken aback by the ferocity of the woman's attack. They tried to reason with them. When that failed, they resorted to force. How long can unarmed women resist a battalion? They were finally gathered in front of a makeshift dais, where Yudhishthir assured them they had nothing to fear. He vowed that they would suffer none of the evils that befell the women of a defeated city. He offered them food and water, and a safe place to rest while the dead were taken care of. But the women wailed and cursed, their grief replaced by rage. They didn't want his charity. Having taken everything from them, did he think he could appease them by something as paltry as refreshments? They beat their breasts and asked him to murder them too, and thus spare them the bleakness of widowhood and its endless humiliations. If he was too cowardly to kill them, they cried, at least he should allow them to die an honorable death on their husbands' pyres. We will die, some of the more militant among them cried. Which man here dares to anger the gods by denying us the final right of a faithful wife? They broke away from the group and rushed at Pyres. Others followed them, keening as they went. Threatened with divine anger, the guards tried to stop them only half-heartedly. Many of them pulled back, reluctant to intervene. Soon, if a quick remedy wasn't found, there would be a stampede followed by mass suicide. Aghast, Yudhishthir stared at what was happening. If it had been a battle, he would have known what kind of command to give his men. But here he was at a loss. Paralyzed by guilt and compassion and the ancient and terrible tradition the woman had invoked. I could see on his face a further concern. The tragic death of so many women at the very beginning of his reign would be a stain on his kingship, a devastating karma for him to bear. But neither he nor my other husbands knew how to prevent it. When I climbed onto the makeshift dais, my intention was only to stand beside Yudhishthir, because he seemed so alone. But, to my surprise, the woman stopped fighting to get to the pyres and turned toward me. Was it the unexpectedness of seeing a woman up there? Or did they know my story, all the way to the last bloody night? For that's how swiftly stories can travel. I wondered if they were thinking that I deserved everything that happened to me. I remembered how, even before the war began, a woman had made the sign against the evil eye at me. How much more reason did these women have to hate me now? My palms grew sweaty as I looked at their hard faces. My eyes burned, but I could not weep. Since my children's deaths, tears had deserted me. My mouth was dry, as if stuffed with cotton. I knew that if I stood there much longer, I'd be unable to form any words at all. And this one moment of opportunity, this one moment when I had their attention, would be lost. Before this, I had never addressed a crowd, though I recalled Dhri's tutor discussing, earnestly and at length, the importance of powerful words. He had said they were the sharpest and subtlest of weapons. It was crucial for rulers to use them correctly, swaying their audience with the appropriate intonation, tugging at their hearts as a master musician does his lute strings, mesmerizing them until they obeyed the speaker blindly. But even if I'd been capable of such manipulation, I didn't want to, not with the images of my dear dead still floating in front of my eyes. Instead, I started too fast and too loud, and did not know what I would say. I found myself mentioning the bereavement we shared, for I, too, like them, had lost a father and brothers. I admitted my guilt about the part I'd played in bringing this war about, and asked for their forgiveness. When I spoke of the children, my voice broke and I had to pause. I told them that, unlike me, who was left childless, they had a responsibility toward the sons and daughters they had left at home. Who would take care of them if the women killed themselves? I was not sure what I said after that. I spoke as though in a trance. I think I said, in spite of grief, we must live for the sake of the future. For the sake of the future, I promised them I would take their children, for certainly I would have no others, as my own, and make sure they lacked for nothing. I had started to address the woman as a queen might her subjects, but as the words formed in my mouth, I spoke as a mother among mothers, and together we wept. It fell upon me, the wretching task of guiding my husbands to our dead. There was no one else who knew what I longed to forget, where and how they had fallen, what their dying gestures had been. I pointed out the mangled bodies. Ghatotkacha, who, in the extreme pain of his end, had thought only of our good. Uttar and his father Virat, who had sheltered us in our distress, not knowing the ultimate cost of that hospitality. My father, his eyes open in death, his mouth drawn back in a grimace of disappointment, for he did not live to see the vengeance he had spent his entire life planning. Reaching the mutilated corpse of the young Abhimanyu, I described to my husbands how bravely he had fought, even when overwhelmed by so many experienced warriors, and saw pride mingle with the sadness on their faces. But as we proceeded, I grew confused. Which of the dead should I single out, and which should I ignore? What of Salya, uncle to the Pandavas, who had helped us the best he could, even though he was tricked into fighting for Duryodhan? Drona, his headless body twisted in his chariot, who had once taken their child hands in his and taught them how to bend back their first bows. I looked into the blood-encrusted face of Lakshman Kumar, Duryodhan's son, his eyes wide with surprise, as though he hadn't expected death to win this game of tag, and it blurred into the face of one of my boys. And now we came to Karna's body. I kept my face averted, but it seemed my heart would burst from agitation. I couldn't bear to think that there was no one to mourn this great and unfortunate warrior's passing. His friends were all dead. Kunti could not claim her kinship with him, and I could not express my grief. My husband remarked casually on the smile on his face. "Why," Nakul asked, "did the body not give off a stench like the other corpses?" Arjun spoke magnanimously of his valor, for it is easy to praise those you hate once you have killed them. When Yudhister said, "I wonder who his parents really were, and if they knew he's dead," I couldn't bear it. I fell to my knees and said, "Husbands, you must cremate every warrior who died in Kurukshetra with due honor. You must pour ghee into the fire for them all and offer rice and water so that their spirits may be at peace." Yudhishthir agreed at once, but as he called for arrangements, we heard a voice behind us. "No," it cried, "you have no right to touch my sons, whom you butchered along with their loyal friends. I will not allow you to offer prayers for them and thus lessen the punishment that awaits you in this life and beyond. I will take care of my own dead." It was Dhritarashtra. He had always been stalwart and tall in spite of his infirmity, but overnight he had aged, spine bent, hair greyed, forehead marked by grief's ravages. But Gandhari, who led him by the hand, stood taller than ever. The anger on her face, ice white as the scarf that covered her eyes, frightened me more than her husband's outburst. Her years of prayer and abstinence had given her great power. Would she use it now to harm my husbands? I reached for Yudhishthir's arm to warn him, but I was too late. Everyone knows what happened next. How the old king, with piety on his tongue and murder in his heart, pretended to accept Yudhishthir's apologies, his promise that he'd be a son to them. He held out his arms in a gesture of forgiveness, calling first for Bhim, who had killed every one of his sons. But once more Krishna saved us. He pulled Bhim back and gestured to his servants to bring out, instead, the iron statue upon which Duryodhan had so often vented his hatred. Dhritarashtra tightened his arms around it until he crushed it. Then he wept with genuine regret, for hidden behind the anger and envy, there still remained some concern in his heart for his brother's children. Seeing this, Krishna explained his ruse and reminded the king that the Pandavas had been pushed unwillingly into war by his own son. The least you can do to make up to them for all they have unjustly suffered at Duryodhan's hands, he said, is to truly forgive them and give them your blessing, so that their hearts might find peace. Dhritarashtra obeyed Krishna, but something broke in him as he touched my husband's head with the tips of his reluctant fingers. Perhaps the knowledge that until his death he would have to eat Pandava salt was too much for him. From that day on, he spoke little and gave up all kingly luxuries. He ate only once each day and slept on the bare floor. And though Yudhishthir entreated him many times to take his place as king in Hastinapur, he never again entered the Sabha to sit on the throne he had so coveted. And Gandhari? She was wiser than her husband. She knew that her sons had brought about their own downfall. But even wisdom is no match for a mother's pain. When Yudhishthir touched her feet, her rage manifested as fire, burning his fingernails black. And when Krishna snatched him away, she poured that rage on him. You were the mastermind behind my son's destruction. Because of that, your own clan will destroy itself in the span of a single day. On that day, your women will weep, just as the women of Hastinapur are weeping now. Then you'll know how I feel. I stared at her in shock, but Krishna said, with his usual equanimity, all things must end some day. How can the house of the Yadus be an exception? Then his voice grew stern. But tell me, aren't you responsible for this war too? Who indulged Duryodhan when he was a boy, instead of punishing him for the things he did to his cousins? Who couldn't bear to banish Sakuni, because he was your younger brother, from the palace, even though he was an evil influence on Duryodhan? Gandhari bowed her head. Krishna continued more gently. Duryodhan broke his word again and again. He took from his cousins through trickery what was justly theirs, and then, after they had fulfilled all the conditions he had placed on them, refused to return it. You know this yourself. Isn't that why, when Duryodhan asked for your blessing, just before he went to Kurukshetra, you didn't say, "May you win"? Gandhari was weeping. Krishna put his arm around her shaking shoulders. Instead, you said, "May the righteousness prevail." I know it was difficult for a mother to pronounce those words, but you did the right thing. Now that your words have come to pass, how can you hate those who were merely the instruments of universal law, which ultimately must restore that which was out of balance? She turned to him, then, sobbing against his chest. "Forgive me that terrible curse. I want to call it back." "There is nothing to forgive," Krishna said as he led her to her tent. "Whatever you pronounced, even that was part of the law." But what I remember most clearly are Krishna's words to the blind king when he insisted on cremating his dead by himself. "You call them mine, and you call the others theirs. For shame! Hasn't this been the cause of your troubles ever since the fatherless sons of Pandu arrived at Hastinapur? If you had seen them all as yours to love, this war would never have occurred. Wasn't it the cause of my troubles too? Of every trouble in this world? We had thought that the day was done with its surprises, but it had kept hidden in its recesses one final secret. As the Pandavas stood holding lighted brands, ready to begin the cremation of our children, Kunti came to them. Her eyes were bleak, her voice held a quiet and terrible resolve. "Wait," she said. "You must begin the ceremony by paying respect to your eldest brother." And, as they stared in amazement and growing shock, she told them, though it was a lifetime too late, the truth about Karna.